Well, let's see. I have a card in front of me I've never seen before. I know John. I've known John French for a while, quite a while actually. But he showed me a card today that says John French, alienist. You got to tell me what that is. I just thought you were a lawyer.
Lawyer? I've never been so insulted in all my life.
He's a forensic psychologist.
Forensic psychologist, and alienist was the word that emerged in England during the 16th century to describe physicians who worked with the mentally ill.
Yeah.
And the name evolved from the fact that in those days the prevailing belief is that people who were mentally ill or psychotic were alienated from the true faith, and that's what made them mad. And so those who ministered unto these unfortunates were known as alienists.
And that's still in the penal code?
It's in the California Penal Code.
Yeah, isn't that funny?
And so I decided one day that if I'm an alienist, I better have a card that...
And you got that, you came up with that idea from an in-court experience?
Yeah, I do a lot of testifying in court, and there was one lawyer there who was very frustrated with me, and finally, in exasperation, he made reference to me as the evil Dr. French. And so I figured, well, what the hell? If I'm the evil Dr. French, I'm going to have a card that,
And you'll notice it's black and gold. I won't put the numbers out, but you can see. John is an interesting guy. You are a super interesting guy, actually. And, we met through art collecting. John has a wonderful collection. He likes a lot of different things. But he's got this, other side of him, which is really interesting, which I've used for my Charles Bloom murder mysteries, which we can talk about. But I want to go back, if you don't mind, John. I want to find out where you started, because I know your dad was quite a collector and had a pretty amazing collection, right?
Yeah, he began collecting art, I guess, in the 60s maybe. And when he and my mom moved back to Massachusetts, where she came from, he met a couple of dealers, including a very well-known Boston dealer by the name of Alan Fink, and at the Alpha Gallery in Boston. And they became friends, and they traveled together. And then my dad really got serious about this stuff. And I was already in college when they moved there, but the house from that time forward was just full of really good art. We're talking Marston Hartley's, we're talking Sargent, we're talking any of the people that were in that sort of Cape Ann artist community from the the turn of the century up through the 30s. And the walls were covered with this stuff, original oils, and so.
And where did you grow up?
I grew up in Texas until I got into high school, and then they moved to Connecticut because they didn't want a redneck boy in the family. They wanted a little more cultivation.
Did it work?
I think so. Yeah.
Are you sure?
Not always, but.
So you grow up in Connecticut. Your dad has a place in Massachusetts. Is this in Gloucester?
Well, he was mayor of Gloucester, and it's in one of the little villages surrounding Gloucester called Annisquam.
Yeah, which is where Hartley would go to paint.
Yeah.
A lot of these guys went to paint, right?
Yeah,
Who all
sure.
Went into Gloucester to paint. Do you remember?
Well,
did Hopper go there?
Hopper was up there.
Yeah.
My dad had a Hopper.
Yeah.
Who were some of the people? Damn it, Mark! I'm reaching a point where I'm forgetting names.
Yeah, no, maybe Kroll went up there. It's possible. And there's another guy who did boat scenes that's very famous. I can't remember his name. It starts with like Gilbert or something to that extent.
Well, they'll come to me. It's just the brain is just working.
But I know
a little
Hartley
more.
was.
Hartley was my favorite of all of them.
Yeah, I've always been a huge fan. I mean, he went to New Mexico in like 1917, 1918. That was the only period he was there, and did some fantastic stuff.
Yeah.
But, my gosh. And of course, Dallas Contemporary Art Museum has one of his most famous war scenes that were paintings, one of those big kind of badge-looking, metal-looking paintings that was done for his ex-lover who died in World War I. And but as a kid, you could remember seeing the Hartleys on the wall?
I would have been in college at that point.
Yes.
Yeah, oh, sure.
Yeah.
In fact, I was really angling on one that was a very sort of cubist painting of Dogtown, which was a favorite motif of Hartley's.
Yeah, it was.
But my dad left all of those paintings to the Cape Ann Museum, which helped kind of put that museum on the map, you know.
And so you can go visit those?
Yeah.
What is that like when you go back and see your, I mean, it's kind of your heritage and all those wonderful paintings, but they're not yours anymore, but your dad's name's on it. Is that, what is that?
It makes me want to sit down on a couch and open a beer and stare at him,
yeah,
you know.
I bet, right?
Because, you know, he had, you know, these things around the dinner table, and every night when we had dinner there, you know, you're staring at a Hartley, you're staring at a, oh God.
Hopper. Sounds right.
I'm sorry, I just can't remember the names, but all the major figures
Right.
from that era were represented
Did
in his
Andrew
collection.
Wyeth go there? Or was he
He's from Pennsylvania.
yeah, I didn't know if he spent time in that.
He may
area.
have. I mean,
Yeah.
that was everybody. It was sort of, you know,
It's where
expected.
they all went,
yeah,
right, to paint.
yeah.
And so when he met this gallerist in Boston, was there a flip for him that he all of a sudden just became overwhelmed with art?
Well, you know, my dad, when he was younger, I never noticed that he was interested in art. I think this came to him later in life. And he was enough of a pragmatist to know that he hadn't really developed his eye that well. And so Allen was sort of a borrowed set of eyes for some years. And they traveled to Europe. You know, they bought paintings over there together. They were good friends.
Yeah, and so he was a serious collector.
Yeah, and
Spending
over
money.
time he developed an eye so that he knew what he was looking at. But at the beginning, you know, he didn't. And I can remember, you know, when they lived in Evanston before they moved out there, he would go to a gallery and buy some, you know, contemporary paintings that were, you know, not that good, and wound up in the attic eventually, you know. But when he really got into the good stuff, I mean, he just took off, and he had a lot of paintings.
He became obsessed.
I wouldn't say that he was obsessed, but he was, you know, he made good money, and the older he got, the more he preferred art to politics, and so he just began buying good art.
And so at what point in your life would you think that you started being interested in art? Because you're clearly very interested in art.
Well, when I was in college, I hung out with kids from the art school because they were the most interesting kids. But it wasn't until the first piece of art I bought was a piece of African art, and I got that from Jim Willis. And that would have been, sort of probably in the mid to late 80s.
You still have it?
Oh, yeah.
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 What is it?
It was a mask from the Grasslands area, what they call a bozo, that was a mask of probably an ox or some kind of horned domesticated critter, which wasn't a great piece of art, but I had and still do, Jim's still kicking, barely, but you know, I had an opportunity to buy some world-class pieces from Jim because basically he'd allow me to pay him off when I could.
Yeah, and you did get some great. Yeah.
Oh yeah.
So African art's in there.
Well, the African art is probably the finest, but I've got pieces from Indonesia. I've got pieces
Which
from
you just
Mexico.
Came back from, right? You were in
Yeah.
Indonesia for. I saw you in a tunic and a hat, kind of a thing.
Oh yeah. I think I still have that on my iPhone. My daughter got married in Bali, so.
Yeah. And did you buy art when you were over there?
Oh yeah.
Of course. Yeah, that's a real art. So that was 83 when you bought your first piece.
Yeah.
But when did you graduate from high school in Connecticut? What time was that?
That was in '62.
Okay.
And then I went off to college in St. Louis.
University of?
Washington University.
Oh, Washington University.
Yeah.
That's a great school.
Yeah, it's a damn good school.
Yeah, I almost went to medical school there. I considered it.
And that was actually, I was a bit of rough trade, you know, in high school because of where I came from and never quite fit in. And then when I got to college, you know, my freshman year, I was just I was a little out of control, you know.
In what way?
Well, I mean, you know, here's all these girls, and here's all these, you know, places where you can, you know, go drink beer, and
Right.
you know, and so it was like, what? I'm supposed to read these books?
I got it. School became less interesting than the
But you
opposite
know,
sex.
long about my sophomore year, latter part of it, I think I had two professors who independently pulled me aside and said, you know, why are you behaving this way? You're really smart. You write well. Do you know how well you write? You know how many students I have to read this stuff, and I like reading yours.
Yeah.
And I wasn't really even thinking about it, but they got my attention.
They cared.
And when I came back for my junior year, I made the dean's list, and I got totally into literature. And then from there was, you know, that's probably the beginning of it. The literature sort of led to other forms of artistic expression, music, and then, you know, the visual arts. But my main thing over all these years has basically been tribal art, which would include Native American.
Right. And so when did you graduate? So you go to school in 62, so like 60,
I
66?
graduated in 66. I went up to Minnesota for a year.
And what was your degree in?
English.
It was in English, huh? And so the Vietnam War was on at that point,
Yeah.
66. And then what, did you get pulled into that?
No, I don't know why not.
Yeah.
I just never got a draft notice.
Yeah, well, that'll do it.
You know, which was fine by me. I don't know what I would have done, but I wasn't about to go over to Vietnam and fight in some stupid little war like that, you know.
So you'd kind of made your decision.
Oh,
already.
yeah, I don't know what I would have done, but I would have done something. I was not going to participate in that madness.
Yeah. So in 66, you graduated, and so where did you end up going to?
I went to University of Minnesota for a year and studied with some really good professors up there, Sarah Youngblood and G. Robert Stange, and that was when, I mean, I liked the education I had at Washington, but when I got up there around, you know, this was high-powered, the English department there was one of the best in the country, and they knew it, and, you know, that's probably what, you know, whipped me into shape in terms of just, you know, being able to write coherently and, you know, really understand what a paragraph means and that.
You had to compete on a higher level.
Oh,
too.
yeah,
And
sure.
were you getting a graduate degree at this point?
I was going to, well, I wasn't really sure what I was after. I just wanted to go there and continue studying.
Yeah.
And after a year, then things started changing and the war was going on. And I kept hearing from friends of mine about what it was like in California. So I transferred to UC Berkeley. And which had a very difficult time. This was in 1967.
Yeah, Summer of Love.
They had a real hard time competing with the Hate and the Grateful Dead, whom I got to know.
Yeah.
Because their manager was a guy named John McIntyre, and he had been a friend of mine at Washington University. He was a year ahead of me, and so he came out, and he was the only guy I knew when I moved to San Francisco. And he said, well, hey, come on over here, you know. So I figured out a way to get to where he was, and I walk into this old Victorian on Fulton Street across from the park, Golden Gate Park, and it was just full of musicians and hippie chicks and dope dealers. And I'm thinking, what the hell is this? So I asked for where McIntyre was, and they said, oh, he's up in the office. So I go upstairs, and there's John, you know, smoking a big fat joint and doing accounts for the band, and it was this band called the Grateful Dead. I'd never heard of them.
And this was 67?
67.
What month? Do you remember? Because that was the Summer of Love right there.
Yeah,
That
yeah.
started
The
in, like,
Summer
July,
of
right?
Love was, at least in terms of its sort of public manifestation, was pretty much over with by the time I got out there. I got out there like in
Fall, September.
Yeah, September probably.
Yeah.
And, you know, the Hate was still, you know, as crazy as it had ever been. And there were still plenty of figures there. And the concert scene was just incredible. I mean, there were 3 and sometimes 4 different ballroom venues there. And, you know, sometimes your biggest decision on a given day was, well, am I going to go see the Dead or Jimi Hendrix or...
And did you go see Hendrix?
Oh, yeah. I mean, it was... You could not avoid it.
Uh-huh. And did it help having the manager of the Dead being your friend? Was he able to get you into places that
anybody could get
didn't
tickets.
matter?
You just had to, you know, have a little foresight, like a week.
Yeah.
You know, you didn't have to buy them 6 months in advance.
Yeah, and they weren't expensive either.
Yeah, and that's not how people thought in those days. You know, they would make up their minds that afternoon whether or not they wanted to go see a concert.
Did you see besides Hendrix, the Dead?
Oh, I saw Cream. I saw Frank Zappa. I mean, whoever they were, they came through there. The Who.
Yeah.
They all came through there. San Francisco was where it was a music center of the universe.
Yeah. And when you arrived, how long was your hair? Do you remember?
It got longer.
Yeah, I was going to say. I bet by the end of the 67 or first part of 68, it was a little longer.
I never had a page boy, but I did have hair that was longer than it had been.
Yeah. What did your dad think about that? Or did he know?
Oh, he knew. But my dad was sort of a tolerant but aloof intellectual type guy. So he might make a casual remark now and again, but it wasn't like, you know.
He wasn't like, get your hair cut.
Yeah, get your hair cut or hit the road, you know. No, he was never like that.
So that must have been an exciting period of time to be in Berkeley. You were living in Berkeley, or
no? I
was
in
San Francisco?
I never lived in the East Bay. I found a place, a nice apartment in San Francisco, that was almost within walking distance of the Haight, and then I moved over to Nob Hill, where I had 2 different apartments there almost up until the time I went to graduate school.
And so were you going to school while you were there in San Francisco
No,
at this point, or were you just enjoying the fruits of being youth in San Francisco in 67, 68?
I stayed at Berkeley for about 2 years, and I could see that, you know, I wasn't getting anything out of it. And the social atmosphere that I really liked when I was an undergraduate, and to some extent had at Minnesota, just wasn't there. It was like a big corporation. You know, you didn't get to know your professors very well. I never got to know any of the students very well, and it just felt, you know, it didn't feel like home to me. So, you know, I kind of went to class for an extra year or so, but I was really much more interested in what was going on in San Francisco.
Yeah, just the social scene.
Well, yeah, and it wasn't just the rock scene. I mean, you know, I went to North Beach a lot. I met a lot of writers. You know, I met Allen Ginsberg.
Yeah, what was that like?
He was he's a pretty nice guy. You know, a sort of iconoclastic and not always the easiest guy to talk to, because you ever no, I don't want to compare him to Yogi Berra and Casey Stengel, but he had his own way of talking that it was kind of hard for me to fit in. I much preferred Charles McCabe, who was the Irish, you know, opinion writer for the Chronicle. Charlie was a proper Irishman, and he would go to Gino and Carlos every morning and have 3 cans of Rainier Ale while he penned his column.
Yeah.
And then he'd go home and take a nap, and then he'd go out on the town when he woke up.
And how did you meet Ginsberg? How did that happen?
Over at City Lights Bookstore.
He was just in there?
He was in there,
hanging?
and right next to City Lights was Vesuvio, which is an iconic old San Francisco bar, and then across the street was Specs, the what they call the Museum Cafe. And so these were, you know, sort of central areas for gathering in those days, you know, in the 60s and 70s, and I guess, Vesuvio's still there. Specs passed away last year, but these were great drinking establishments, and full of writers and poets and so forth. So the conversation got pretty heady.
Yeah, and you just, so he would be in there making conversation with a lot of other writers and intellectuals, and
Ginsberg was across the alley from City Lights Bookstore, which is where Vesuvio was. And he was just in there with some people, and I knew some of the people he was with, so I got introduced and, you know, just sat there and was part of a group conversation for a while, drinking beer, and it was cool. I mean, you could have those experiences in San Francisco in those days.
Yes. Well, and even earlier, I think. Dixon saw this, you know, it was very bohemian.
The Beat generation and all that stuff, yeah.
And so at some point you said, okay, I probably need to make a living. And
I had an epiphany one day, and this was it's when I turned 30. You know, they used to say never trust anyone over 30.
Yeah.
Well, I became untrustworthy.
You were 30.
And so I really did. I had to kind of stop and think. Well, you know, I'm working for this, you know, labor union that sets up all the conventions and which was kind of a nice gig because you didn't work during regular hours, because the conventions would be going on those hours. So when you set them up and took them down, it was either, night work or weekends, and you got,
Sounds like what my son's doing right now.
And so, and a lot of the guys that were in that union were also artists because that kind of fit with, they wanted to be artists during the day, and so this is how they made their money.
Latitude.
Yeah. So I did that for a number of years, and then I began to realize, I'm this child of the middle class. I have college degrees. What the hell am I doing?
And I'm 30.
And I'm 30. So I wound up going to a professional school to get a Ph.D. in psychology, and that's what I did. And
why psychology? I mean, from literature to psychology, that's a little bit of a jump.
It is. I had actually developed an interest in marine biology. And I thought, God, I'll be out there with Jacques Cousteau, and this kind of stuff. Well, that's not how it works, You need, courses in molecular biology and physics and, all of this stuff that's basically mathematical in the laboratory. And I started going to City College of San Francisco to get these courses behind me so I could go to a regular university and study marine biology. And they had a couple of UC Santa Cruz and UC Davis both had courses in that. Well, I couldn't get out of I was surrounded by 18-year-old Asian kids with slide rules who were kicking my ass. And I couldn't get it. I did not have the head for all these mathematics and biochemistry and stuff. And after a year, one of the teachers I had pulled me aside and said, "Look, I know your history, and
you're a good writer. Go to that."
He says, if you want to study behavior, why don't you try psychology? Because you're not going to have to learn, all this biochemistry, and I can see how hard you're struggling, and you're just not getting anywhere. So I took that advice and went to the California School of Professional Psychology, which was, I didn't consider it a very good school after having gone to a couple of excellent ones. Right. But I stuck it out, and I got a Ph.D. in '79, and then...
And how old were you then when you started your career as a clinical psychologist?
Okay, that was '79. I would have been 35.
35.
A little late in the game, but I got out of school.
Doesn't look like it now, but...
No. I got out of school, and I needed a job. And a buddy of mine was working down at the jail. And, being in a professional graduate school, a lot of what you do is clinical work. Right. And I had to have these practicums and clinics and stuff like that. And I just hated doing therapy, at least as it was normally done. I'm not all that empathetic. I don't find it that interesting. I just kind of want to kick him in the ass and say, "Come on, stop sniveling and get out there." I wasn't that kind of person.
Yeah.
But when the last place I had was a place called the Tenderloin Clinic, which was actually should have been a sitcom, because when Ronald Reagan emptied out the mental hospitals, and all these people hit the streets. Yep. A lot of them came to San Francisco, and so there was almost like a crisis there. And the state of California needed to get a clinic there, but they also had to have qualified people running it. And then that's when things got really interesting, because there was a gay mental health collective called Daffodil, which petitioned the state at the same time under Short Doyle legislation to operate a clinic for people, for gay people or people with, some gender problems, sexual problems, whatever. And so in their, sort of evil self-interest, the state said, "Okay, tell you what we're going to do. We're getting a new clinic down on the Tenderloin, and you can run that clinic, provided that you also take non-gay related patients from that particular catchment area, which was the Tenderloin district." Yeah. So this clinic was all gay staff except for one psychologist who happened to be a teacher I had at CSBP. And so the waiting room would be full of these gay guys and then these floridly psychotic people that were living on the street.
Yeah.
And who, as a group, tend to be very homophobic. So they needed a couple of people in there to deal with that. So this guy, David Brandt, the psychologist, he comes to me and says, look, I can get you this job. You're going to like this place. And it was just like, what was that cop sitcom with Abe Vigoda and...
Yeah, I know the one you're talking about. In the 80s.
It was like that. It was just wild down there. The things that people would do and the tension between the gays and the psychotics
and so that was your first professional job as a psychologist?
Well, no, it was that was my last internship. So that
was
kind of
actually an internship.
Yeah.
Oh wow.
And when I first started there, I mean, half the staff there were lesbian separatist women who had no use for men, particularly some redneck out of Texas. So I had to figure out, how I was going to live with these people. So I actually kind of exaggerated my redneck ways a bit. I didn't try to be their friend because, they were so politicized that would make them even angrier, right?
Yes.
So I just, I'd come in there wearing cowboy boots and, I did everything but wolf whistle. But they needed someone to do evaluation because they had to see some of the crazy people. It wasn't just gay people. They had to see
everybody.
Whoever came through the door.
Yeah, and there was a huge influx of people at that point. I know.
So they all decided, well, we need evaluations on these guys. That's where I got started doing psych testing. And I it was just like, there was nobody there to tell me, what I could and couldn't do. I knew testing. That was the big thing I had in graduate school. It's what I got good at. And so I had people right off the street that nobody knew anything about. Sometimes they weren't even sure their names. And so I would wind up doing these psych evals for them. But I tailored those evals for these, these kind of either touchy-feely or nickel-plated, gay people, whichever, part of the spectrum they were on. And after a while, they started liking the reports because they were helpful. And by the end of that first year, they were going, I wasn't so bad after all. I would get invited to clinic parties and stuff like that. And I danced with some of these women, Yeah. So it was cool. And when I graduated, a guy who subsequently became my partner for many years said, look, I got a job down at the jail. I can get you in here. You want to come work in there? And I think, well, hell, after the Tenderloin Clinic, working in the jail ought to be a snap,
Yeah. I bet you saw some amazing psychiatric pathology.
I mean,
completely out of control people, too.
Mark, my January will be my 40th year in this business.
Yeah, that's a long time.
Post-graduation.
Yeah.
So, I've seen a lot.
Yeah, and that was probably, that was by fire, really. Birthright by fire, going to that place.
And a good thing, too, because when I got started, they didn't even have a name. Forensic psychology, what's that? They didn't even have a name for it. The closest they got was criminology.
Yeah, tell people what a forensic psychologist is, for those that might
basically,
not know.
if you look up the word forensic in the dictionary, it basically means that it's a science whereby you establish criteria for a certain, procedure. It's a very kind of vague, all-inclusive term. But forensic psychology, as you boil it down, it's the nexus of psychology with the law. And you can do criminal law, you can do civil law, you can do administrative hearings. Anytime, either a defendant in a criminal action or a plaintiff in a civil action. For example, in civil actions, personal injury cases, sex abuse cases, they could be claiming all of this distress, and then, that has to be evaluated and substantiated in some kind of way. That's part of the process for, getting awards. And of course, in criminal cases, it's, is somebody not criminally responsible for what they did, or perhaps is this guy even competent to go to trial? So,
and would you work for the state most of the time?
If you're doing competency evaluations or sanity evaluations, those are court-ordered evaluations. So you are working directly for the court or the state. which for someone like me is, at least in my opinion, is more comfortable because you're not an expert witness for one side, which means the other side gets to beat up on you. If you are working for the court, and particularly if you're working in front of the judge who appointed you, they kind of have to back off and tone it down.
Yeah, you're supposed to be kind of neutral, basically.
Yeah.
You should be.
Well, insofar as it's possible for anyone to be neutral, ultimately, I'm not sure. I mean, ultimately, I think you have to recognize your own struggles with neutrality in order to have a chance at behaving.
You have bias.
Yeah, you have to understand your own biases.
Really hard, I would think.
Well, my
Almost
bias is
sometimes.
that, yeah, I mean, my bias is that people are generally responsible for their behavior. That's, music to the ears of a prosecutor, but not to a defense attorney. So people can say that I'm biased, and I guess in a sense I am, but you have to, the only way you're going to be able to control that bias is to recognize it,
Right.
For what it is, and just make sure that you're not, going too far with that.
Yeah, so when you go into a case, you try to keep an even keel, not make prejudgments of the individual, regardless of the amount of press that they have gotten. And I'm sure some of these guys and girls are big time murderers and things
Well,
like that.
the longer I've been doing this, I've sort of floated to the top, and it's at this point, even though I'm thinking of retirement, everybody knows who I am.
Right.
There are no secrets here, and so yeah, I'm like, and some of the people who have been around as long as I have are likely to get the heavy duty cases because the courts don't want to take a chance with some newbie in there who screws it up.
Right. Because you have to not only do an evaluation, but you have to follow certain protocols, I'm assuming. And
Yeah.
if you miss cue on any of those protocols, you could cause a serious problem.
The protocols are both clinical and legal.
Yeah, that's what I mean.
Yeah, and so you're following sort of two protocols at once. And then, of course, there's courtroom testimony.
Yeah, which has to be really interesting because they want to probably eviscerate you on the other side.
Yeah. And when I first started doing this, I got my ass handed to me more than once, and so that, and I watched the way other people handle themselves who were doing the same kind of work, and far too many of them are inclined to think they're there to help the attorney who retains them. I have my own mantra for that.
Yeah, what's that?
The attorney who retains me is my enemy. That it's a little bit tongue in cheek, but there's a lot of truth in that because that keeps me honest.
Yeah. In other words, unbiased as much as possible.
Yeah, and when I first started out, guys, they would say, well, I can get you paid more, or we got a really big case coming along after we take care of this. Well, they're practically bribing you to see it their way.
Yeah.
And I learned pretty early on that you can't fall for that stuff. And if you have to tell them to screw off, you tell them to screw off. And maybe that costs you some work early on, but eventually you get a reputation.
As being someone fair.
That you can't be pushed around, that you're not for sale, that you're going to call it even if, sometimes you're mistaken, which is inevitable on occasion. I'm going to see it my way.
There must be times that political pressure comes down too, I would think, on certain big cases.
The only real political pressure I ever had came from a possible candidate for president in 2020, and that would be Senator Kamala Harris. She ran the DA's office in San Francisco for a while, and for some reason, she had a problem with me, and I don't know where that came from because I never did any work for her as an attorney.
Yeah.
And we crossed swords a couple of times, and I can remember this old Chinese judge, Len Louis, who was my mentor. He said, John, now listen to me, John. You know I love you, John. You know that? You don't want to mess with her. Don't want to mess with her. If you have to kind of look like you're kissing her butt, kiss her butt. He said, you do not want to mess with her. It'll pay off. Just take it.
Yeah.
You can take it. You're a tough guy, John, right? That's how he talked.
I figured it must be. Yeah. And so you were able to navigate that?
I basically just stayed out of her way.
Yeah. Yeah, she's a tough girl, I guess. Then.
Oh, but I voted for her.
Yeah,
and
very
if
good.
and if she runs for office, I'll campaign for her.
Yeah, very good.
She's a nickel-plated bitch, but you know what? She's smart. She's tough. And if any of those people that have those kinds of aspirations, I think she's the toughest.
Yeah, she seems to be extremely intelligent and well versed in the law.
And
from
you
what I've
know,
seen.
I mean, I think she could beat Trump on any level, mano a mano,
Yeah.
including the physical.
Yeah, well,
She's
he's old now. And
Well, yeah, with those heel spurs, man.
so you do run across those where you get political pressure occasionally.
I've never had any. I mean, that's as close as it came. But you do. You have to maintain a certain balance. You know, you don't want to be doing mainly prosecution cases or mainly defense cases. You know, and I try to keep it evenly balanced. But what I have going in my favor, just because I've been around so long and I know everyone, is I know who to avoid. I know who to, you know, I know when to be so busy I can't take a new case. Sorry, you know, try it against, you know, and just kind of like, because I don't want to work for that guy.
Yeah, especially at this point in your career.
Yeah,
you
I don't
probably
have to.
right?
I don't have to.
Now, has there been one case that really kind of stood out that was either super high profile or was just so interesting that, you know, if you hadn't have been on that case, that it might not have turned out at least in your mind, the correct way? That's a lot of cases over 40 years, but
Yeah, somewhere between 5,000 and 6,000.
it's a lot.
And I think what I would find an interesting case isn't necessarily what the man on the street might find interesting, just because I've done so many cases that, you know, some little quirk here that I find, you know, well, I really like this. I mean, I've got a case now where this guy, you know, really beat up his girlfriend. But turns out they were both into, what do they say, BDSM, bondage and discipline sadomasochism. The problem is she was, if there is a right way to, you know, carry on in that fashion, she carried it on the right way. This was consensual. We'll agree to do it, and, you know, and blah, blah, blah. I mean, we're talking about, like, you know, sort of faux strangling and stuff, people losing consciousness. You know, a lot of these people that do that a lot, and that can kind of identify them, they take paramedic courses so they can revive people if some of this stuff gets out of hand.
Oh, interesting.
It's weird.
Yeah.
But in this case, this guy he had problems, and so he when they were arguing or something, he would get into that, you know, stuff, but not in a consensual way, and it would take it too far. So I'm having to parse that. I mean, that's
Yeah.
just one little example. I wouldn't consider this a major case.
Yeah, where does the pathology leave and the crime begin?
Well, I mean,
basically?
my feeling in that case is, you know, I'm doing an evaluation on the guy because he's the perpetrator.
Yes.
But she's been a perpetrator in the past. Why aren't we doing evaluations on her too? You know, I mean, it's a funny little thing.
It's a gray line. You found a case that's quite gray.
Yeah.
You never had to do any of the cases like with Richard Ramirez, the Night Stalker, wasn't he out of San Francisco?
Yeah, he was, and I watched some of his trial, but I didn't have that case, and they never they never pled him insane. That was just a done deal. You know, he was way too prolific.
Yeah.
They had way too much going on.
And was he a
him.
psychopath?
Oh yeah, he
Yeah,
was.
he's
He
a
was
true
yeah,
psychopath.
he was
Yeah.
a very, very dangerous guy.
And why is that? Tell us a little bit about it. Because I find, you know, because I write murder mysteries, and I know you helped me with one of the people that I portrayed in one of the books who was a psychopath, and I know you gave me some interesting insights, but maybe you can give a little...
Well, a psychopath,
mind.
you know, there's a lot of misunderstanding in the public. You'll hear people say, oh, that's a psychopath, he's psychotic. Psychopaths are not psychotic. Psychopaths, as a group, tend to be very well organized, premeditated. It's not that they have like a mental illness. They're not schizophrenic. They're not bipolar. It's what they lack that's
Yeah.
important.
They have to think their emotions. They don't have them.
In fact, Robert Hare, who was the world's preeminent researcher on psychopathy, and has developed a so-called checklist for helping identify psychopaths from other types of criminal behavior, even other types of murderers or what have you. He's, in the last half dozen years, 10 years or so, he's done a lot of brain research using brain imagery. Their brains function differently. And I can give you some good examples for that. They basically don't have emotions like the rest of us. So they can be very unfeeling, but they're great mimics.
Yeah, that's where they think their emotions.
Yeah, they tend to be bright guys.
And usually are guys.
Yeah. I've met a couple of female psychopaths. But yeah, I don't know if I coined that phrase to think their emotions. I may well have read it somewhere, but that's really what they do. And if you stop and think about what that really means, I can give you an example. Hare uses various little tests that kind of catch these guys, and in one that I thought was really interesting, he would do photographs of people whose facial expressions would show fear, anger, frustration, depression, love, compassion, all these different emotions. And they normed this test on ordinary people, and the ability to perceive the emotions accurately from these photographs was very high. It was well over 90%. Excuse me.
Because they have to.
Well, that's
to mimic.
Well, we're not talking about the psychopaths here. We're just talking about the ordinary people upon whom these photographs were normed.
I see.
We want to know how normal people respond to this. And the accuracy level was over 90% because that's in our genetic coding.
Right.
That, if we can't recognize other people's emotions, then we don't have much of a society.
Right. Especially small cues. It's amazing, just like
yeah.
eyebrow up, you just know what that means.
Try to figure out the feelings and intent of someone you just met who starts sending you text messages. What can you get out of that? Not much at all.
It is hard, and it's easy to misconstrue these too.
Well, what they noted in the psychopaths were not only was their hit rate a lot lower, but even more importantly, their latency. Where you or I would look at one of these photographs in 1 or 2 seconds, we're going to say, oh, that guy's in pain, that guy looks depressed, whatever. The psychopath has to think about, where have I seen that before? What does this likely mean? So their hit rate would not be that low, but it was the time it took them to reach that conclusion that tipped you off that there's some other kind of process going on. And on some of the subjects that they suspected to be psychopaths, that they actually were doing brain scans while they were doing this, you could see what parts of the brain were lighting up, and it was mainly the frontal cortex, not the amygdala and the areas in the brainstem where most emotion arises. It was up here. They're thinking it.
Yeah.
But at the same time, he did a related study where they would show him these photographs 3 or 4 times so that they could identify the picture with what the feeling should be, and their ability to learn that way was really good, so they could fake it.
Yeah.
So those are they're good mimics. They tend to be charming or at least a little imperious. They have a style which may be off-putting or may be very endearing, but there's nothing there, and it's like you might sit next to a psychopath on a bus and have an interesting conversation with him, but if that's a Trailways bus going through, across the country, probably in a day or so you're going to sit in another seat. You know what I mean?
Yep.
Because you start to feel like, no, there's something wrong here.
Yeah, something a little off.
Yeah.
If assuming you have those abilities to pick up those kind of cues. Because it's hard to pick out who a psychopath is, right? My
experience is that most people have, the capacity to pick up the cues, but if they haven't, the best they can do is say, well, there's just something not right here. But then I've talked to plenty of victims where they thought maybe there was something wrong with themselves. You know, that they with their
They
ability
caused
to,
it or something.
yeah, they had a problem and they weren't reading this guy right. Well, they probably were reading the guy right.
Yeah.
They just didn't know that that was an option.
And it's a fairly rare thing in society, isn't it? 1%?
Hare thinks they're on the slightly on the increase because psychopaths as a group have tend to have more children than other people because they just walk off and leave the woman there. So genetically, they're kind of, you know, spreading their genes.
Yeah, they don't have any problem with that.
Yeah, yeah. So, and there are plenty of, you know, quote, psychopaths, unquote, who never break a law. You know, some of these, I don't want to be politically incorrect, but I could think of one person in particular in a very high place politically in this country who shares some of those features. And, you know, some CEO heads, a lot of, or there could be that your goofy old Uncle Charlie who never amounted to anything but isn't hurting people. They can have some of the same inability to show compassion or connection with other people, but they're not out there killing them.
Yeah. So there can be a spectrum of.
Yeah, there's a spectrum of it. Yeah.
Like in almost any human, I guess, you know, genome and characteristics. There's always that, and that brings us back to art. Why people collect art. You know, it's also on that spectrum because there's a certain group, I think, of people who collect that just have to. I would put you into that category because, you know,
Well, I'll
if you
tell
have
you.
free time, you're going to go to look at art or collect or.
Well, yeah. Whenever I have free time, more than 2 weeks, I get on a plane and fly someplace around the world.
And what is that about art that pulls you so?
Well,
do you know?
My principal interest, as I believe you know, is in tribal art. And tribal art almost always has, or at least arose from, significant ceremonial and religious beliefs. My big interest that really, for me, unites psychology with the kind of collecting I prefer to do has to do with the images that native healers use, shaman, people like that. There's some really fabulous research out there, and has been for you know, I can remember when I was in graduate school reading some of this stuff. You know, E. Fuller Torrey's The Mind Game comes to mind, where, you know, the ordinary person might look at a shaman in Southeast Asia or a so-called witch doctor, which is not what they call them in Africa, and think that burning incense or killing a chicken and reading the entrails and all that kind of stuff is just complete nonsense. That the only sensible way of treating people is what's evolved in the West. But that depends on the kind of disturbance you're talking about. If you're talking about schizophrenia, bipolar, major psychotic disorders, there's a lot of truth in that position. But if you're talking about, you know, particularly neuroses, you know, milder forms of anxiety and depression, and I had one of the few really good professors I had when in graduate school in psychology was an old Viennese psychiatrist named Neil Russick. God bless him. Very cool guy. And he used to say, Jonathan, you must always remember that all forms of therapy have two things. One is confession, and the other thing, Jonathan, is confession and suggestion. So somebody comes to you, and using the term confession very loosely, with a problem. And you, as someone who's experienced, you don't have to have a Ph.D. in psychology and work in a Berkeley family clinic. You could be a shaman, and if you're dealing with people all the time, people and their problems, you know, your understanding of those people is going to be pretty good.
Yeah, especially that small group. If it's a smaller group.
And if you realize, okay, this guy believes he's possessed by an evil spirit because he can't make love to his wife, or whatever the problem may be, you're going to know that there's probably something else going on. And so you put certain ideas into their head just the way an American or a European therapist would do. And then, of course, the guy, he has to somehow pay or expiate himself, either by paying the therapist, writing a check to the therapist like we do here, or bringing the guy a cow, or just having to give something up so that he's making a commitment to making this thing work.
Yeah.
And the research that's been done shows is that, old Neil Russick was right. When you're dealing with less catastrophic mental illness, that the chances for healing someone that the shaman use is about as good as the therapists, that we know here in the U.S., and in my opinion, in some cases, probably a little better, because they do have a smaller, coherent belief system. There's a smaller number of people, and everybody buys into the process.
Right.
And if you think having to, have smoke blown in your face is crazy, well, what about a theory that says all little boys want to kill their fathers and have sex with their mothers?
Yeah, the Freud.
Sigmund Freud.
Yeah.
What's crazy?
Yeah. And so that kind of religious connotations is the kind of tribal art that you also are drawn to?
That's primarily what I'm drawn to. That's if you were to walk around my house, you'd see.
So you like textiles and pottery and things as well?
And I was part of a film crew in Laos back about 6 years ago, and we went into northeastern Laos, and the wife of one of the guys on the crew was a Tai Deng woman, and we got to people in that complex of villages and were allowed to interview the shaman and to film the ceremonies. And I was the cameraman. And when I met these people, they were already doing this kind of research. The leader was a gal named Ellie Finley, who was a professor of religion at Trinity College in Connecticut. And I was really, it's something I was always interested in. I'd made my own sort of ineffectual forays into that, but here was an organized group that was making it happen. And so I got really excited about that, and they asked me if I wanted to join them. And I said, yeah. I said, well, can you operate film cameras? You know how to do film? I said, oh, sure. Not.
Yeah.
But that expedition was 6 months away, and so as soon as I got back to San Francisco,
you started educating yourself.
I bought about $3,000 worth of camera equipment and filters and lenses and all of this stuff. I went to the Bay Area Video Coalition, and I took courses there for about 3 months, and I had someone a tutor. By the time I got over there,
You were ready. I
was ready.
And so, what did you take away from that filming?
Well, when you were talking about material, the main material there, I've never heard of a mask being used in that part of Southeast Asia. So their magic items were textiles. And there were silk, and probably some of the finest silk textiles in all of Southeast Asia came from that area of Laos. And some of these textiles were very, very subtle. They would, for example, they had their own category of evil spirits who lived in the jungle or in the rivers or wherever. And they had a belief that if you could, in the proper way, weave the evil spirit into a textile and sanctify that textile, you've essentially captured it, and you can turn its powers to good use. And there was one, I had a chance to buy one of these, and I just didn't have the money because it was very expensive. The most sophisticated example was a textile. I'm trying to think, what did they call that? I think it was a pi'iyun. And they had two different white threads, one just slightly moving towards the beige end of the spectrum. But if you didn't know that, you'd look and think it was all the same thread. But they actually wove in either ciphers of the shaman himself or some other spirit that was a good spirit, and then cover it up with the rest so that if bad spirits came to that ceremony, they wouldn't see what was in there, because most people couldn't see it unless you knew it was there.
Right.
And I saw that in use. I was able actually to film that being used. And that's when, if the shaman feels like there's just too much bad energy around, that the ordinary textiles aren't going to be sufficient, so they would use one like that.
Yeah.
So this was very, subtle, sophisticated stuff.
Well, I think that's one of the things about collectors, real collectors, is they like to get deeper into why things are made, how they're made, the history, how they relate to those people, and how they relate to you as a person, as a collector. And it's clear that you have gotten to that point on many levels for many different art forms.
Well, yeah, I have a number of African masks. I have some ikat.
But I also know you collect things that just you like visually too.
Oh, sure, sure.
On a regular basis.
Yeah, no, these are, like I got this nice bracelet from you a few years back.
Kenneth Begay, we might point out.
Kenneth Begay, you bet. That's my favorite.
Nice early one.
This doesn't have that kind of ritual significance, but for me, it kind of broadens out to stuff that's more decorative. But for me, given what I do for a living, and having this interest in ethnographic material, particularly of a ritual nature, and even though I'm not a treating clinician, I feel like I have a view of psychology and the human mind that a lot of my colleagues who haven't done all this work in other cultures don't have.
Yeah, gives you an advantage for sure.
And it just, in a place like San Francisco, you get people from all over the world. Sometimes they show up in court.
Right.
And those are and there are a couple judges who know what I do. I get those calls.
Yeah, because it helps with that client on many levels. I would think.
And a judge will want to know, well, is there any substance to the statement that they were following some religious precept when they were doing something that over here would be considered illegal?
Right. Is there a cultural bias?
Like
we don't see.
Physically disciplining a child too harshly. I had a Cambodian case once some years ago where they moved over here. They're refugees, and when their daughter got into middle school, she started running around with African American kids, which really upset the family, and they were certain that she was having sexual relations with some of these guys, and so they decided to put a stop to that. And they got Cambodians can make some damn hot chili sauce and pepper, and they rubbed some of this stuff on her private parts as a lesson.
Horrible.
And then they and their attorney wanted to say, well, this is what people in the rural areas of Cambodia do when their daughters start when they jump the fence and start running around. And I knew that was bullshit.
Yeah.
So I was able to back that up with
just
and I have a huge library on all this stuff that's not just about art, it's about shamanism, it's about the the belief systems of all these different countries. And I was able to go in there and say, no, that's not.
They're just abusing their child horrifically and shouldn't be allowed to do that.
Yeah.
Plus probably be parents. Well, we've covered a lot of areas. It's been over an hour for sure, more like an hour and 30 minutes.
Well,
but it was so fun to have you. I knew it'd be interesting just to pin you down on a few things. For me, when I write murder mysteries, I always have you in the back of my mind as a person I can call for, because you want to get it right as a writer.
Yeah, well, you want that verite.
Yeah.
And an awful lot of people, when stuff gets really baroque and unusual, it kind of scares people. I mean, and you can see that in certain types of offenses too, most notably arson and sex offenses.
Right.
It scares people because they don't understand it. So, for better or worse, this is stuff you have to,
Yeah.
you know, you have to know.
Yeah. Yeah, we'll leave it at that. For better or worse, Jon French. Thank you, John, for
Okay,
coming.
well, thanks for
All
having me,
great.
Mark.
Let's go look at some cool bracelets and stuff.
Okay, let's do
All
that.
Sounds good. Jon French, Ardila Diaries. Thank you. Gallery, located for over 26 years in Tucson, Arizona, specializing in antique Native American art, early Western art, including the famed Maynard Dixon, as well as modern art. You can find everything online at medicinemangallery.com. There's over 6,000 objects to select from. Also, the Charles Bloom Murder Mystery Series, written by yours truly, me, Mark Sublette. There's 6 books in this series, and they follow the protagonist Charles Bloom through all the intrigue of the art world set in Santa Fe and the Navajo Nation. These can be found on Audible, ebooks, Amazon, and of course, the gallery at medicinemangallery.com.